Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really happy to have you for the 8th in our Stream Compensatory Mitigation webinar series. My name is Rebecca Kisslinger. I'm a Science and Policy Analyst at the Environmental Law Institute, and I direct our Wetlands program. This webinar series is hosted by ELI, but was really developed in coordination with an advisory committee of stream mitigation experts, and the series is funded by an EPA Wetland Program Development Grant. So we thank you all for your support. For those of you, this is the first time on this webinar series, or if you're not familiar with ELI, we're a nonprofit law and policy research organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Our wetlands program provides timely, balanced information on wetlands law, policy, science, and management through research, education, and convenings like this stream mitigation webinar series. We have a lot more information and resources on our website. You can also join our mailing list, Wetlands and Waters, from that website, so please check it out and let me know if you have any questions. So we've had a really great lineup of webinars for this webinar series. We kicked it off last July with a status of stream compensatory mitigation webinar. We've had webinars on assessing stream functions, on barrier removal, watershed approach, monitoring and performance standards, defining and using reference, and last month we had a webinar on credit debit determination. And today we're talking about stream restoration for multiple purposes. In 2 weeks, we have another webinar planned on long-term performance. You should see an invitation for that webinar in the coming days. And then we'll wrap up the webinar series in June. You can find all the presentations, the past presentations, and recordings of the past webinars on our series webpage. The URL is here on the first URL there. The second one is the URL for this webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at the email address there. Let me know. So for today's webinar, I'm really excited about today's webinar. We have an excellent panel and a really interesting topic today. As you all know, stream compensatory mitigation projects offset permitted impacts to streams and can also yield significant ecological benefits. So we're going to talk about that, multiple benefits today. Projects that leverage or integrate other programs can help to achieve these other programmatic goals. So we're going to discuss stream restoration for multiple purposes, including endangered species conservation, water quality improvement goals, and natural resources damages restoration. And we have a really excellent panel lined up today. We're going to start off today with Ruth Ladd. She's the Mitigation Program Manager for the Regulatory Division for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers New England District. And she's been at the New England District since 1991. At the district, Ruth administers 5 statewide in-lieu fee programs and 1 umbrella mitigation bank. She has also played a lead role in the development of an innovative special area management plan for vernal pools in Maine. For permitting responsible mitigation, Ruth serves as the technical resource for permitting and enforcement project managers, EPA, and state agency staff. She also helps develop guidance related to mitigation for regulatory staff and the regulated public. Previously, Ruth was the chief of the policy and technical support branch. Ruth attended Connecticut College for her bachelor's in zoology and the University of Massachusetts Lowell for her master's in environmental science. And Ruth is going to talk about an in-lieu fee program where they've integrated endangered species and 404. Then we have Beth Balker, the program manager with the regulatory branch in the Baltimore District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She's currently the chair of the IRT in Maryland, responsible for reviewing and approving compensatory mitigation bank and in-lieu fee instruments. Her additional responsibilities include development of branch policies and guidance to increase permitting efficiencies. Beth has 27 years of experience working for the Baltimore District and has prior regulatory experience in both state and local government agencies. She has a Master of Science in Public Health and Environmental Biology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a Bachelor of Science in General Biology from the University of Maryland, College Park. And then finally, we have Andy Gregg. He's a partner and general counsel with RestoreCap, a West Coast-based firm that specializes in transforming marginal or abandoned real estate into productive habitat projects. Andy has over 25 years of experience in environmental law, corporate and real estate law, and ecological restoration. He drafts and negotiates legal instruments associated with the creation and transaction of environmental credits. He has a BS in geological engineering from the University of Nevada, as well as a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School with a certificate in environmental law. So as you can see, we have a super experienced panel today, and I'm really looking forward to their presentations. But before we get to that, just a few logistics. Right now I have you all on mute, but again, we really do encourage you participating in the webinar today. And you can do that by typing in questions into your question box on the right-hand part of your screen. Just to get you warmed up, and I always like to do this to see who's on the phone and make sure I'm not talking to thin air. If you could let us know where you're listening from, and if there's anyone else in your office, type that into your question box, get warmed up. Feel free to type in your questions at any point during the presentations, and I'll ask the panelists those questions at the end of each presentation, and we should have a little bit of time at the end of the webinar for some more discussion. If you have any technical questions, you can feel free to email me at that email address on the screen, and I will do my very best to try to solve those during the webinar. Again, I have posted all the presentations on the URL for this webinar, and that URL is there on the screen. Let me know if you can't find it or if you need it again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth to get us started.
So
Perfect,
are you
Ruth.
seeing my slide?
Yep. We're right on your slide.
Right.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. As you can see, I'm going to talk about how we have integrated both Atlantic salmon restoration and Section 404 mitigation into an in lieu fee program. So I'm going to talk about sort of what the goals of the project. This is sort of the thought process we went through. Actually, those first 3 bullets is sort of what did we want to accomplish, and did we actually need it? And if so, for what exactly? And what is the process to make it happen? And then I'll talk a little bit about where we stand now and what our next steps are. So these are the guys that we're doing all of this work for. Atlantic salmon, which are not the same as the Pacific salmon. And they're the reason that this program was able to happen. So our goals are twofold, and recognize the fact that we're doing this under the for the benefit of both the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act Section 404. We want to achieve the no net loss of species, the Atlantic salmon, to therefore offset the impacted resources with functions of equal or greater value. That's right from the instrument. And for 404, offset the loss of the aquatic resource functions lost through impacts that are permitted by the Corps of Engineers, or potentially it could be in the future, perhaps the state, although it's not set up that way at this point. And I think that it's important to realize we're very interested in species other than just salmon. We set this up because we have the federal laws that protect the salmon, and then the Clean Water Act. But we're interested in the species that support the salmon, such as herring, but also other aquatic species that could benefit from a restoration of the stream functions, such as anything from turtles to macroinvertebrates and everything else. Because quite frankly, the salmon are in deep trouble, and whatever we can do to help all the aquatic resources in the area can be beneficial. The first 3 of these need items are pretty obvious, that permitted activities can have in-stream impacts, and it provides in lieu fees, provide the option for mitigation. You have to go through the avoid and minimize first, and then we want to make things better for the Atlantic salmon in Maine. But we also want to be able to accomplish ecological benefits regionally and within entire watersheds. And we do that in addition to just sort of the traditional way of thinking about in lieu fee programs. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. We can get funding, projects can include funding from other sources. We just have to prorate the credits. I'll mention that again later as we go on. This is just an example of the type of project that would be appropriate for funding through this project. It was actually funded through our wetland program in Maine, the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program, but it's an example of the sort of thing that could be appropriate. We went from having a barrier as a result of undersized culverts to having this very large arched culvert. And this is another one. Also, actually, it was funded by the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program, but it would also be appropriate for the salmon in lieu fee program. Quite frankly, back in the beginning of our wetland in lieu fee program, we funded a few of these, and then we stepped back and said, well, we're not really getting a lot of wetland credits. So we have stopped funding them through that program, but they would be appropriate for the salmon in lieu fee program. So the other program actually has banked stream credits, but can't use them at this point. So for the process, it's important to have some regulatory backup, obviously, to make these things happen. So we have the Corps' Compensatory Mitigation Rule published in 2018, and then the fact that the Atlantic salmon has been listed as endangered. And then there's some policy for the Fish and Wildlife Service. There have been some changes in how they are handling things at this point, but the salmon is still considered endangered. So we started the process, it was a two-pronged effort, if you will. It started out that the Maine Department of Transportation was having to deal with the Fish and Wildlife Service frequently for consultation on road crossings. And so they decided they wanted to come up with some sort of programmatic agreement, particularly for general permits. So they were talking about how to handle that. And I had come to the National Mitigation and Ecosystem Banking Conference back in 2014, and thought at the time, maybe this is an opportunity to do some sort of in lieu fee that would help the salmon. So serendipity really played a role here. Those two things kind of came together, because when I contacted Fish and Wildlife Service, they said, oh, well, guess what? We're talking with Maine DOT, and they were giving some thought to maybe there could be an in lieu fee program that could benefit them and could be wrapped into their programmatic agreement. So we joined forces, and because Maine DOT really needed this program to make their permits process faster, they were willing to put funds into its development. And they contracted with the Conservation Fund to develop a draft prospectus, and that included having a white paper prepared that addressed how to determine fees, assuming that the in lieu fee instrument actually progressed to that stage. Actually, it was not as simple as this slide maybe makes it appear. We list the sponsor being the Maine Department of Marine Resources, but we actually had a prospectus before we had a sponsor. We had a draft prospectus. And then it's like, well, okay, we have to have somebody who's going to service the sponsor, because since DOT had funded the development of the prospectus, they were not going to be the sponsor. They just wanted this thing to get done. But we then need to find somebody to do it. And Maine Department of Marine Resources was involved in reviewing the prospectus and involved in our discussions. So over time, they agreed they had to be sure that they felt comfortable with what was required. They agreed to service the sponsor. Excuse me. The IRT members are actually determined by the co-chairs of the IRT, and we're really particularly excited to have the Penobscots on the team, as both the Penobscot River and salmon are resources of great interest to them. So I was very pleased that they were willing to participate. And the reference to conservation partners relates to how the procedure that we're going to be using for the program, which uses an RFP process. So in order to find projects, the sponsor would send out a request for proposals that would go to, be made available to NGOs and conservation agencies, which could then submit proposals for various projects that they in their application would explain what the benefits are to both salmon and just aquatic resources in general. And they would be reviewed and scored according to special criteria. And if they're approved, then the applicant would do the project and monitor it. However, Maine Department of Marine Resources remains responsible for providing the credits should the project fail, and hence the reason that they wanted to make sure they felt very comfortable in taking on this role. It's very, it can be potentially a big risk. So they looked into that closely. Ideally, there'll actually be funding from other sources as well, and I alluded to that earlier, where you might have funding that comes from other potentially organizations that give out grants. Could be state agencies, towns possibly, and possibly other federal agencies. And then we prorate any credits that are generated so that the program only gets the credits of the percentage of the funds that are put in by the in lieu fee program. That's a really important point. So the area covered, as you can see, it covers most of Maine, but not all of it. The brown area is the distinct population segment, the DPS, that it was originally, and the red outline is the newer expanded one. So in 2000, that's the brown, and 2009 it was expanded to the red area. There are 3 service areas: Mary Meeting Bay Salmon Habitat Recovery Unit, SHREW for short, the Penobscot Bay SHREW, and the Down East Coastal SHREW. We do have landlocked salmon in Maine, but this program is not intended to address their needs. And you should note that that there are all those watersheds that could provide habitat for salmon if only they could get to it. And usually unoccupied means it's inaccessible. So those are all potential opportunities for this program to make things accessible. The fee determination really has been one of the hardest parts of the program. We need something that would be, as I say here, consistent, defensible, and user-friendly. So actually there was a contract to get a white paper to work through the options for how you might figure out what would be appropriate for fees. What kind of data is there out there, and how much the projects that would typically be involved are going to be removing barriers. So how much do they cost? And of course, there's a huge range, and it does vary through the state as to how much it costs to do that. So this paper came out with recommendations of what appropriate fees in the service areas would be. However, quite frankly, there is considerable, I think of the word slop. In other words, it's somewhat flexible, so that if need be, there could be some adjustments. It's not hard and fast, but it definitely shows a process to consider what to consider. So this is the current fee schedule. You can see the 3 areas, and then the 3 columns address the prices start out at the price per critical habitat unit, which is 100 square meters. But since most people think in terms of either acres or square feet, we have a column for the price per square foot, or somebody really likes meters, we have one just for meters, but that's a pretty obvious number. Just for comparison, the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program charges from $2.90 to $4.30 per square foot of wetland impact. So the status, we went out for the prospectus went out for the 30-day public notice back in 2017. And there was a lot of discussion that went on between then and when we actually got the instrument signed, which happened actually just last fall, with the intent that it would be primarily used by the Maine Department of Transportation, but other entities could use it if need be, if they are applying for a permit and need to have coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or even just are impacting streams within the service area that are just a 404 permit and doesn't even necessarily have need to involve the Fish and Wildlife Service. It could be used for that. Now that the Corps does have that possibility, and actually Fish and Wildlife Service could use it when there isn't necessarily a 404 permit. But credits can only be sold once, so no double dipping. So next steps. Well, so far we haven't had any project use it. And so this has us at wondering why. Why is that? And it comes down to cost. Turns out, and we did talk about this before we ever finalized the thing, but didn't realize quite how it was going to work out. So the difference in cost between generally DOT has committed to building at least a one-to-one structure, which means that it's bank full to it's a bank full width, whereas the desired for this under the for the programmatic agreement is 1.2 times bank full width, so wider than bank full. And sometimes the difference in going from like either an arch culvert or a box culvert or whatever it is, to go from that 1 to 1.2 appears to be frequently less than what the in lieu fee cost is. And because it's a state agency, they have to look at the dollars. That means that cost is really the primary driver for what they decide to do. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Marine Resources are really having a conversation now about considering the fee adjustments in order to make it affordable, but yet there will be adequate funding to be able to do the projects that we need to do. This is ongoing, so I don't have an update, but it's where we stand right now. I think it's a really exciting program. It has a lot of potential, but this was sort of unexpected snag that we ran into. That's where we are. As I said, we don't actually have any payments into it. We're hoping it will happen soon. Please note on my contact information, I'm actually retiring in 2 months. So Casey Clark is the person you should contact with information. I know they're working to fill my position, but I don't know who that is yet. So at this point, the best contact is actually Casey Clark. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was really interesting. Lots of interesting challenges. That cost challenges is fascinating. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and type those in now. I have one question before we change it over to Beth. I was wondering, as I know there are a few more of these kind of in lieu fee programs that might have both 404 and endangered species credits. Do you have like one piece of advice or one thing, as other programs are developing, or that you would pass along?
Well, just make sure you have everybody who is involved, including if there is some entity that is likely to be the major user of the program, be sure to have them included. I mean, we're just really lucky that DOT really played a huge role in this case. But I think that it was also really helpful because they could help a lot in having us understand what kind of projects were likely to trigger the need and what the comparative costs were of what they would do sort of as their minimal and what they needed to do in order to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act in particular, but also Section 404. And that really helped to direct how this whole thing worked. Of course, we obviously didn't get it quite right because we don't have the fees quite right yet, it appears.
Yeah. So someone just asked a question about that, trying to understand that a little bit more. And the question is it that the cost difference between the 1-to-1 and 1-to-1.2 is encouraging DOT to purchase and install a structure that avoids impacts? Or can you?
Well, the issue is, in some cases, they have to do 1.2 because of the critical nature of the stream that they're crossing. But in other cases, it turns out that, it's in this area that is, quote, potential salmon habitat, but everybody agrees that there's really nothing, nobody cares if it actually meets the full crossing standards because there really isn't habitat that's going to be adversely affected by having a smaller culvert or bridge or whatever it happens to be. And everybody would be perfectly happy with doing one-to-one, but because it's cheaper to put in the bigger one, DOT will put in the bigger one rather than pay the in lieu fee.
Okay, I think that helps a lot. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, great. Thank you again, Ruth. If you have any more questions, we'll hold those to the end and we'll move on to Beth. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Beth, we can
Oh,
see
okay.
yours.
I wasn't sure. Okay,
Yep,
well,
we're good.
thanks. Okay, great. Hi, and good afternoon. Today I wanted to present an approach that the Baltimore District has developed for authorizing stream restoration projects that are being implemented for the purposes of the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load Program, or TMDL, and then discuss a growing market for stream restoration projects for both Chesapeake Bay, TMDL, and Section 404 compensatory mitigation purposes. First, I wanted to provide a little background on the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. The Clean Water Act requires state jurisdictions to adopt water quality standards to protect their waters and establish a list of waterways that are impaired by pollutants and do not meet the water quality standards. So despite those efforts that stakeholders in the Chesapeake Bay watershed had taken to reduce pollution, most of the Chesapeake Bay and tidal waters have been listed as impaired because of excessive nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So in late 2010, the US EPA established the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, aka the Comprehensive Pollution Diet, as I've heard it's called. So a TMDL, just in case I'm not sure, is a calculation of the maximum amount of pollution that a body of water can receive and still meet state water quality standards. And this Bay TMDL program has been a real driver for the planning and implementation of many activities intended to restore the Chesapeake Bay by reducing those pollutant loads from entering. And the Chesapeake Bay limits have been set at 25% reduction in nitrogen, a 24% reduction in phosphorus, and a 20% reduction in sediment. And as you can see by this map on the right-hand side, those reductions have been divided by the 6 states that are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the District of Columbia. And one more thing is that these pollutant reduction limits are all scheduled to be completed by 2025. So now I wanted to provide some more background on why we developed the permit tool in the Baltimore District to streamline authorization of TMDL activities. For each of the 6 Bay states and the District of Columbia, a watershed implementation plan, or WIP, was developed to identify sources of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, and those measures that they could take to reduce those sources. And these WIPs, when you read them, had identified a significant number of stream restoration projects to reduce those sediment and nutrient loading. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, approximately 700 miles of stream restoration was identified for implementation by 2025. And there was a growing sense of urgency as the counties and the state felt that they may not meet their TMDL targets and deadlines, and many of these stream projects needed to have core permit reviews completed. In addition, in some cases, the existing core permits that were in place at the time did not sufficiently cover authorization of some of the types of stream restoration projects that were going to be implemented. So in 2015, the Baltimore District developed and issued the Bay Total Maximum Daily Load Regional General Permit, or Bay TMDL RGP, to streamline Department of the Army authorization for these stream restoration projects for TMDL reductions and to address improvements to both water quality and ecological functions of the stream system. Historically, early stream restoration projects designed for sediment and nutrient loading reductions resulted in areas of ponding and conversion from one aquatic resource to another, as you can see in these photos. However, these types of stream restoration projects were cited and designed when these types of stream restoration projects are cited and designed, they can have ecological benefits. So the TMDL RGP has requirements for appropriately citing stream restoration projects and has conversion impact limits to address these challenges. In addition, we have seen some stream restoration projects exhibiting oxidizing bacterial blooms and fish barriers. And in this top picture, that's a iron flocculate that ordinarily it is found naturally in streams of the coastal plain, but with certain stream restoration projects, the iron flocculate mats were being enhanced from the leaching of iron-containing stone that was being used for the stream work, as well as mobilized iron from the soils that were influenced by higher groundwater levels after the construction. Riparian tree cover losses and increases in invasive species were other challenges. And as part of the development of the TMDL RGP, the Baltimore District really needed to ensure that potential adverse effects to aquatic resources were minimized to the maximum extent practicable. So the Bay TMDL RGP is applicable within the state of Maryland, the District of Columbia, and certain military installations. At the time when we were reviewing for this development of the permit, we determined that the state of Pennsylvania already had sufficient streamlining permit tools in place for TMDL stream restoration projects and was not included in the permit development. The TMDL RGP is only applicable in non-tidal waters and wetlands of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So in consideration of the need to balance both drivers for maximum water quality and ecological benefits for Bay TMDL stream restoration projects, we developed the TMDL permit within the framework that you see here. First of all, on the upper left-hand side here, the stream restoration projects that would be authorized by the Bay TMDL RGP must have goals to reduce sediment and nutrients as well as restore functions that support aquatic biological resources. Moving over here, site selection must be undertaken through an approved watershed implementation plan, such as a WIP, it's called a WIP, to focus restoration efforts at locations that would provide the most benefit in terms of the sediment and nutrient reductions, as well as improving stream function. Proper restoration design and techniques need to be supported through the use of a stream function-based assessment, such as the Stream Functions Pyramid Framework by Will Harmon. And those impacts that are authorized must not be exceeded. The impact thresholds from the Bay TMDL RGP must not be exceeded. Specific stream reach degradation criteria need to be met to ensure that only low quality degraded systems are impacted. And certain projects may require coordination with federal and state agencies. And then of course on the right-hand side, we have certain projects are going to definitely require monitoring to ensure that the projects are achieving those expected functional gains. Other support to the framework comes from quarterly meetings between regulators, applicants, and practitioners to discuss preliminary stream proposals and leads to open communication, better understanding, so that we can work together to get the best practice in the right location with the least amount of impact. In addition, the Chesapeake Bay Trust and other funding partners have developed this great award program that supports restoration research, which is particularly focused on the effectiveness of watershed and water quality restoration practices. And we use, where appropriate, the results of that research to inform better permit decisions. In looking at the TMDL program, so in general, the regulatory program has two types of stream ecological restoration practices: the Chesapeake Bay TMDL and 404. And this is in general. There's probably other ones too, but this table kind of outlines the similarities and differences of stream restoration performed under these two different practices. In looking at the project objectives, the TMDL program really has the primary objective of reducing sediment and nutrient loading, since those are the pollutants identified by the Chesapeake Bay TMDL program. However, through the TMDL RGP issuance, that permit does also require the restoration of aquatic resource functions to the degraded stream, which really aligns it better with the Section 404 compensatory mitigation objective. In addition, the implementing mechanisms are different for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. This is really implemented under a state water quality program, whereas the Section 404 compensatory mitigation follows the federal mitigation rule. In addition, users of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL RGP are generally public sector. So the jurisdictions, the counties, the state, the federal installations, federal agencies, those are the ones that use and are required to meet this Chesapeake Bay TMDL loading, whereas Section 404 compensatory mitigation does have both private landowners and public agencies that are affected and can use or are users for that stream restoration practice. And finally, one really important difference is that the 404 compensatory mitigation has more extensive standards for monitoring, site protection, financial assurance, performance standards, and long-term management and associated funding, all that is required in the federal mitigation rule for a compensatory mitigation plan. And there's growing interest, though, in having a stream restoration project for both TMDL reductions and Section 404 compensatory mitigation purposes. So some of the considerations that we've been having for combining these two practices are that stream restoration credits can be used as either 404 offsets or as a TMDL offset. But once debited for either purpose, the credits are retired. And this ensures, at least in the Baltimore district, that we are not selling, or in Maryland and the District of Columbia, this ensures that we're not selling the same function or credit choice. Tracking and accounting can be challenging when combining these resource restoration types at one site. So ledgers really need to be clear to avoid selling or counting a credit choice, and it's helpful to partner with your state water quality agency in order to track this accurately. Also, the entire stream restoration project should meet the more rigorous 404 compensatory mitigation standards and managed for that maximum credit production that's provided. Overall, combining this mitigation and the TMDL stream restoration project really has greater utility to a mitigation sponsor or a mitigation provider and can incentivize a broader market for different credit users and also address both the federal and state programs. So in doing that, we would likely see better project designs and larger, more comprehensive projects for ecological lift rather than just the single function sites that you might see just for TMDL sediment and nutrient loading function. So next steps, the Bay TMDL RGP is up for renewal next year. It's coming up quickly, but we're looking to incorporate lessons learned and key technical and programmatic issues into our reissuance decision so that the permit tool can ensure that only high quality projects resulting in pollutant reduction that's verifiable and reliable and has and these projects also result in restoration of stream ecological functions. This reissuance process is going to involve public outreach to get insights and experiences on where the current version of the Bay TMDL RGP may have worked well, and also where it may not have worked so well. And then the other final next steps is we also have it's very exciting, we also have an interagency team that is working on a stream mitigation protocol for Maryland that can be used to consistently evaluate and assess stream impact and mitigation. And that's any questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. That was really interesting, and I think we'll lead well into the next presentation, but we do have at least one question coming in, and feel free to now type those in, and I'll read the first one. This question is about Virginia. Has Virginia reached out for lessons learned in using the same restoration project to achieve 404 and TMDL goals?
I know I've talked to a couple people. In fact, just on the whole ledger issue, I've in fact reached out to, I think, Wilmington District as well as Norfolk District on how they've been doing the ledgers so that they can keep the credits straight, because it can be very confusing, especially with the way the TMDL credits are assessed. But that is something, you know, that we definitely try to reach out to each other. I'm not sure if I've actually had Virginia reach out to me on that or not, but I know I've reached out to them.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned that there is some interest in looking to this. Does that mean that there are potential applicants for banks, or is that just a conversation that's going on right now with the 404 and TMDL projects?
So yes, we have had some potential banks being proposed. They're currently in review for use of these multiple credit types at a mitigation stream bank.
Excellent. We have no other questions coming in now. And I'm going to redo the question and see if we need any clarification. The question is, how many projects have been created? And I'm not sure if they mean TMDL projects. Right now, there haven't been any joint projects.
So none have actually been constructed. They're all in review currently. Oh, well, I guess if you're talking about ones that have the multiple credit types, I would say none have been constructed for mitigation as well as TMDL at the same site. However, there have been, I don't know, many TMDL RGP project authorizations issued, and I really don't have that number. I apologize. But many have been issued, and I guess, you know, for stream restoration projects, which is one of the activities that is authorized, but which is the focus of this presentation. But there have been many projects that are authorized within the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia in order to meet those goals, to help them meet their TMDL goals.
Okay.
And if somebody has, you know, if somebody wants me to get to them the statistics, I can, you know, that number, I can actually get that to them. It's just I didn't have it.
Okay. And I think a follow-on to that, can you tell us how many of the projects that are in review for the joint projects? How many banks do you know?
I think there's 2.
Okay. Great. And then one other question I'll get to before I hand it off to Andy. What is the current review time for authorization under the RGP?
Well, the goal, of course, is 60 days when it's a submitted application. However, under the RGP, there's various application submittal requirements. Probably most of the projects that we see, which don't all include stream restoration because there are other activities that are authorized, but many of the activities authorized are non-reporting to the Corps as long as they meet the requirements of the permit and receive any other local and state permits. So many of these projects are not even reporting to the Corps. And then there's another level that are self-verifying, where they don't need to come in for an application to the Corps. However, when they construct the project, they must provide us with an as-built and their function-based assessment information for the project, so that we can actually, they've self-verified, they provide this information to show us that that project has been implemented in accordance with the permit. And then there are projects which are much fewer that require construction notification to the Corps and an application prior, for our review and verification.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great. I'm going to hand it over to Andy now, who is on mute. There we go.
Hello there.
All right, you sound great, and
Let's
perfect.
make sure I'm on the right screen. Hello,
Yep.
everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm going to take this from the private banking perspective, and I'm going to use a bank that we're creating in Portland, Oregon, kind of as an example of some of the challenges of doing these multi-credit restoration sites. If I can get my slide to go, there we go. So as we all know, there's various types of crediting, carbon credits, different types of wetland mitigation credits. Some of these are kind of close cousins and some are completely unrelated. The bank that we're developing in Portland focuses on the riparian mitigation credits under Section 404, as well as natural resource damages, or NRD credits. It's also an approved bank for ESA, Endangered Species Act credits as well. So NRD credits are less familiar to most people than mitigation credits. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on that. So NRD stands for Natural Resource Damages. The regulatory authorization is either under the Oil Pollution Act or CERCLA, Superfund Act. Probably the best example is the BP oil spill. People are most aware of that. Basically what happened there was BP was held responsible not only for the cleanup under the Oil Pollution Act, but also they were responsible for damages to natural resources and loss of resources. So the resource side of things, the regulatory body that governs that in a particular area is what's called a trustee council typically. And an RP, or a responsible party, if they are held liable for natural resource damages, they have different options to settle it. Usually one way is similar to an in lieu fee program, which is they pay a penalty for damages. Another option is for them to create their resources in compensation for that, create a habitat project or some other type of project as settlement for that. And the third option is what we do is buy credits from a private bank. So we are a private bank that creates the habitat. It's approved by the local trustee council, and they approve the release of credits associated with that, assuming we hit the requirements that the trustee councils impose on us. So for NRD credits, it's a different crediting system. Usually the common currency for that is called a discounted service acre year, or a DSA, and mitigation is usually just an acreage type assessment. But for natural resources, the DSAs are the common currency, and the big difference there is it's an impairment over acreage, but also over a certain defined time period. That's where the years come in. And if anybody asked me how it's calculated, there's no way I could figure that out. That's why we have experts doing that. But there's this whole process called the habitat equivalency analysis, or a HEA, that is used to calculate how many DSAs, either liability or created with a particular habitat. So we're doing a restoration site in Linton, which is part of Portland, Oregon. It's located in the Portland Harbor Superfund site. It's about a 25-acre site. We've just gotten approval from the trustee council for the production of about 500 NRD credits with that site. So it's a pretty large restoration site. We're also in the process of finalizing our approval with the Corps of Engineers and the local Oregon Department of State Lands for Section 404 aquatic mitigation credits as well, as a subset of those 500 plus credits. And I'm going to talk primarily about how the challenges have been between creating the NRD credits and getting the approval for the aquatic mitigation credits. So this is an overview of our plan with the site. It's located in a pretty heavily industrialized area along the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon. It's a former plywood mill site that we've demolished the plywood mill, and we're going to produce off-channel habitat for migrating salmon primarily. And that's kind of a photo of the existing site. It goes between basically that tank farm and to the north of that white building you see there, which we've actually taken down by now. And here's the planned restoration for it. So quite a bit difference in the heavily industrial area. So, and I wanted to say, to add to what Beth was saying, these multi-crediting opportunities are really attractive from a private bank standpoint, because basically what we're doing is we're creating these banks and hoping people will come and buy credits from them. So it's all prospective, and the more opportunities we can have to be able to recoup our upfront costs through the sale, different sales of different types of credits, the better. Particularly when these the settlements of these things, NRD settlements primarily, particularly, are all governed by agency enforcement, and sometimes that can just get tied up in lawsuits and all kinds of different things. So it's nice to have an opportunity to sell credits under different crediting schemes, so we can kind of hedge our bets on that a little bit. So I'm going to go through each one of these quickly. Challenges of these multiple credit banks. One is setting a common crediting currency, and I'll talk about all these in turn. Another is, as Beth mentioned, is credit tracking ledgers, making sure that credits aren't sold twice, essentially. Also, I think she hit on this too, is reconciling differing performance standards between the NRD credits and the Section 404 credits, as well as financial assurances, and critical, like the timing of the project approval processes. So I'll go through each one of those. So as I said before, on the common currencies, NRD liabilities are based upon these DSAs, and that's different than the mitigation credits, which is usually based upon acreage. Now, we were able to work with the IRT, the interagency review team up there, which consisted primarily of the Oregon State Department of Resources and the Corps of Engineers. And they've actually accepted DSAs as a crediting mechanism for 404 mitigation, which is pretty unique, and it's one of the first ones that I've heard of doing that. Now there's challenges, because you also have to so we're providing a settlement in terms of DSAs, but the liability has to be calculated in terms of DSAs as well to have that common currency. So there's going to be challenges there, and we're still kind of working through how do you convert between acreage and the DSAs, and that's one of the main challenges we see going forward on these banking systems. One thing that we've able to, and along with that, our NRD, we get credits for certain types of habitat that under NRD that we don't under the 404, namely the upland, riparian and upland sites. So the ones on this map you see that are kind of shaded green and yellow, we're not getting any 404 credits for that. We're getting 404 credits for the purple and blue ones. So that's yet another challenge because we're getting the differing numbers of credits that are produced between the two, and that gets more into, again, the credit tracking, which is the next slide. Again, much as bankers like us would love to double count, we joking. We obviously need to make sure that the tracking is accurate and there is no double counting, especially when you're dealing between different types of credits. And also, the trustee council and the IRT will have different credit release schedules. They don't allow all the credits to be released at one time. You have to hit certain milestones, and each of the entities will require differing milestones. So that's also a tracking issue that becomes quite challenging. The standard tracking system for the US, which is rivets for mitigation banking, it doesn't track DSAs right now. The trustee council is working with that system to try to integrate the DSAs and the NRD type liability into the rivets, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So right now we're keeping ledgers with the hope of translating that into rivets whenever it's capable of handling that. Another issue that we've really struggled with is reconciling performance standards, because we do have two distinct and different bodies that are governing our single project. And so these performance standards, i.e., how do you determine the success of a project? They will differ somewhat, and we've been able to benefit quite well from a very interactive dialogue between the trustee council and the IRT, and we've actually managed to hone these performance standards down to just a very few little issues, and those are mostly like around plantings and density of plantings, that we've been able to just say, okay, we're going to take the most stringent ones, but other than that, the performance standards, we've been very fortunate to have a nice collaborative effort to get those to a minimum as far as, so there's nothing at odds with each other on performance standards. Another challenge has been the financial assurances. So when you put together these banks, you need to provide financial assurances so you can make sure that there's adequate assurances that you'll construct the project, perform maintenance, have long-term stewardship. All of that requires bonding, funding, imposition of easements, a bunch of different stuff. And we worked through all that with the trustee council. And we're just about done with that with the IRT. We have run into a couple snags with the actual, for instance, the bonds that are required, because the bonds, they have access language on there. So in other words, if we were to fail on our project, the trustee council would have the right to exercise the bond. So we're trying to see if we can get a single bond to have both the IRT and trustee council have access to that. It may end up, we may have to double bond some of this stuff, and we hope we won't have to, but those are just the types of things that become challenging, that you don't quite anticipate when you first start talking to the two different entities. And hopefully we'll get that part resolved. And in fact, for the IRT, that's the very last thing that we're trying to get resolved, is the bond forms. Another challenge was just the timing of the processes. Like I said earlier, we just got approval from the trustee council for our project, and we have had uh, we do have some tentative approval from the IRT, but that we started that process a little bit later. Again, we really benefited from advocates on both the IRT and the trustee council really wanting this to happen, because it could have been really easy for us to start down a path with the trustee council and then approach the IRT and say, hey, we've all agreed to this, you guys just need to accept that. And if I were on the IRT, I'd say, no, we don't have to accept that, you know. So I think we had a really good advocate on the trustee council who was really working back and forth with the IRTs to understand, even though they came a little bit later to the game, their integration of their requirements and standards was really important on both sides in order, and so we really tried to integrate IRT comments into the trustee council final documents as well. So that's just the one lesson we learned is try to get those things started as soon as you possibly can together, and then just get representatives talking to each other from the different governing bodies and get an advocate on each one. I think everybody really wants this to happen. One thing I left out is the 404 crediting that we're trying to get for this is related to the Portland Harbor Superfund site, because they're going to have to do quite a bit of dredging out in the river, and they're going to need some mitigation for that. And that's the primary intent of our 404 credits, is to provide mitigation credits for that dredging. So it's in everybody's best interest, and that's where the trustee council and the IRT really have some mutual interest in getting this thing approved. So again, it's just been really important to have that communication, and we've been very fortunate to have it with all the parties. That's about it. If anybody has any questions or anything.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. That was really informative. If you have any questions, you could go ahead and type those in now. Andy, you said you're nearing final approval. Do you have a sense of the final stretch timeline?
For the IRT, I'm hoping it's just a matter of weeks. Like I said, our prospectus was approved. Our MBI is tentatively improved, our mitigation banking instrument. We just really are working through some final financial instruments.
Excellent. Any other questions for Andy or for Beth or Ruth? Okay, here they come. This question it is about the credits. How does the 320 wetland credits relate back to the, is it 25 acre site? So can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, I kind of went over that quickly. So how they, and again, I'm going to get out of my depth pretty quickly here because I'm not the person who calculates the credits. But what they do is there's the HIA analysis. They provide these polygons over. Let me maybe. Am I still on the?
Yep.
Okay. So they, under the HIA analysis, you get certain credits for certain types of habitat that you create, and so it's an acreage and versus where the actual credits are going to be taken. So they put polygons over the areas, and again, the IRT will not accept credits from upland or non-riverine type habitat. So of the 500 plus credits total, the 320 would be part of that. So it's not 500 plus 320. It's just a subset of that.
And they're not, the credit doesn't, one credit doesn't equal 1 acre, it equals.
Correct. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, and that's where these DSAs come into play. That's where the Y in DSAs, the service acre years, comes into play.
Right. So the crediting was done differently than sometimes.
Correct.
and a traditional 404 mitigation bank. So is the super fund or the NRD providing the seed money for the development cost of the projects?
For our project or any of these projects,
For
no,
this
it's
one?
not. It's all done by private investment.
Okay. And there was a question about how much the bank expects to profit, but I don't assume you will answer that one. Okay. And then there was a clarification about about buffers, and that the Oregon IRT is giving some credit for buffers, which are upland, which I think maybe you showed in your diagram.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions coming in? Thank you, Tracy, for that clarification. Questions for Beth or Ruth? Great. This has been a really great webinar. I think it's been really interesting to see, how these different programs can be leveraged so that you can meet differing programmatic goals. I can switch back to me here. And I really appreciate our panelists being here today and giving us these new examples to think about and different challenges that may come up as these new projects. I think more and more of these new projects are developed. So thank you again to the great panelists today. And thank you all for participating and for showing up today for this 8th webinar. As I mentioned, we do have another webinar on long-term performance in 2 weeks, which will be interesting. And then we should be announcing, hopefully soon, the final webinar that will be later this summer. So look out for those announcements. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or ideas for future topic ideas. We'd love to hear from you, especially if you have anything that you would really like us to talk about in that final webinar, something you haven't heard, some way we should be wrapping up this series. We'd love to hear any feedback on that. So let us know. And with that, I'm going to let everyone go early today. Thank you again to our participants and to the panelists, and have a great day. Thanks again.